Week one of the fantasy football season is over, and after 1 week, you're either feeling really good about things or you're concerned about things. But joining us now is senior fantasy writer Heath Cummings of CBS Sports. Heath, thanks so much for joining us. And I want to hit on the waiver wire because there are a lot of people that play fantasy football that maybe had to deal with some injuries or maybe are not excited about the way that their players performed in week one. So I wanted to go position by position with you. And we'll start with the quarterbacks. If you're going to pick up somebody off the waiver wire from the quarterback position, where would you turn to?
Yeah, there's really one guy this week that's available in more than 40% of CBS leagues and that we might want to start. And it's Baker Mayfield, the guy that you probably should have streamed last week against the Washington Commanders, had 4 touchdown passes in that game. You probably shouldn't expect the same type of performance because Washington has one of the worst secondaries in the NFL. But what we've seen is games at Detroit really over the last 3 seasons. It's almost like the Coors Field effect in baseball. Like teams just get up and down the field. And so I do expect this Tampa Bay Detroit game to be a high scoring affair. I expect that Baker Mayfield will be a top 15 quarterback this week, the clear top streamer.
Yeah, and that's another dagger to the hearts of Cleveland Browns fans who, of course, had to see Deshaun Watson struggle yet again. And Baker, of course, he's been great since he's moved on from Cleveland. Let's go to the running backs. And there are a couple of guys that you could go after on the waiver wire after week one. Jordan Mason's one of those guys. J.K. Dobbins, another. Are those two that you like?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what site you play on, because I did see somebody say on a different site that J.K. Dobbins was available in 40% of leagues. CBS drafters were aware and drafting J.K. Dobbins, 95% rostered going into week one. So he's not out there. Jordan Mason, though, still available in 1/3 of leagues and really kind of is like the distinction of whether the waiver wire is exciting or not in your league. If Jordan Mason's available, then you should get pretty excited and make all efforts to add him after a 152-yard performance on Monday night. We don't think this is a long-term absence from Christian McCaffrey, but we didn't think Christian McCaffrey was going to sit out in week one, so we don't really know anything about that situation. Go get him if you can. Zach Charbonnet is option number 2. Ken Walker had some abdominal pains during that game. He's had those types of oblique issues in the past. He says he's going to be okay for week 2, but again, you don't really want to trust that, so Zach Charbonnet is the number 2 option. And then both Bucky Irving and Tank Bigsby looked better than the starting rushers on their teams. They're not going to take the starting job immediately, but they have that type of Jordan Mason upside if something happens to the starter. Now, I want to make one distinction. This is a decent time to do it. Some of these names, Jordan Mason must add. Zach Charbonnet, you've got to go get him. After you get past those guys, like, don't get too excited about adding somebody that's still on their own team's bench in week one just because you're upset over a guy that didn't perform. I got a tweet yesterday saying, should I drop Evan Ingram and pick up Isaiah Likely? Like, if you drafted somebody in the first 6 rounds of your fantasy football draft, you probably shouldn't be punting them to the curb because of one bad game.
Fantasy football drafters overreacting. Come on now. Now, speaking of the wide receiver position, the pass catchers that are available out there, you know, I look at my own leagues and I drafted Puka Nacua pretty early. He's now on the IR. I'm sure there are many other people that dealt with something similar if they drafted him or with some of the other pass catchers that are now hurt. Who are some of your favorite wide receivers that are on the waiver wire right now?
So Rashid Shaheed is my clear number 1 and really got off to a good start in a great matchup against Carolina. We've always seen the big playability from Shaheed. We hadn't seen that type of target volume. So I am encouraged in his first game in the new offensive system that maybe we could see 6, 7, 8 targets per game from Rashid Shaheed, which would make him a good number 3 wide receiver with the upside to be a top 24 guy. Greg Dortch, somehow the clear number 1 wide receiver in Arizona in week 1. Again, we don't think that's going to last. Don't go panic about Marvin Harrison Jr., but we do need to add Greg Dortch, who's available in 94% of CBS leagues, had a fantastic preseason, and then led all Cardinals wide receivers in targets in week 1. And then Adonai Mitchell, if you're just looking at like the number of fantasy points that someone scored, you might look at him and say, why would I want to add him? He had a terrible day. Well, Anthony Richardson showed the ability ability to hit the big play to multiple wide receivers. He had two of them available, though, with Mitchell, missed him on both. I really think, like, don't go add Alec Pierce because he happened to catch one. Don't go add Ashton Doolin because he happened to catch one. Mitchell is the guy with the pedigree and the upside to deliver on a weekly basis later in the year. Go at him.
Now, you mentioned this name before, Isaiah Likely. And yes, you should not drop Evan Ingram just because
Right.
Isaiah Likely had a good game. However, Isaiah Likely was very good in that first game of the season against the Chiefs. I'm assuming he's your top guy in terms of tight ends that you can add, but who are some guys or one or two that maybe behind him in that tight end position that intrigue you?
Yeah, like it likely is interesting for a couple of reasons because it was the Thursday night game, and in some leagues he was already somehow available on waivers and picked up. So he's now 57% rostered. If you're in one of those leagues where he's not, you have to add him. I'm not ready to start him this week just because I don't actually believe that Mark Andrews is going to be as bad as what we saw in week one. But you have to add likely just in case he happens to be the number one tight end for the Baltimore Ravens for the rest of the year. Clear top add. 2 and 3 are both Saints. We saw Foster Moreau. He was injured in week one. Both he and Juwan Johnson caught touchdown passes in that game. If Moreau is out in week two, that'll be more targets for Johnson. And then Taysom Hill, the guy who's just basically eligible at every position now, it seems like, plays quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. Well, he's eligible at tight end on pretty much all sites now. He's about 50% rostered. Didn't have a huge workload in week one. That's because the Panthers weren't competitive, and Hill's 34 years old. In this game against the Cowboys, I think we see a little bit more Taysom Hill. He's not a bad stream this week either.
All right, before we let you go, Heath, who is your favorite riser and who is the biggest faller after week one?
Yeah, I'll go with a couple of wide receivers. And Rashee Rice was a guy who kind of rose throughout the preseason as we realized he probably wasn't getting suspended this year. And because he was playing so much when Patrick Mahomes was on the field. And we saw it in week one. 9 targets, 7 catches, 103 yards. This is in a game when Patrick Mahomes only threw 28 passes. That's an insane target share for Rice. Looks like the clear number one wide receiver for arguably the best quarterback in the NFL. He's a top 10 wide receiver in my rankings this week and a top 10 wide receiver for me rest of season. The wide receiver who's falling is Drake London. And the pedigree's so great. He's so good in contested catch situations. But this is now year 3. It's only game 1, but it's year 3 of us expecting Drake London to be more than what he has been. The hope was comes in and gives him the best quarterback play that he's ever had. What Kirk Cousins gave us in week 1 looked a lot like what Drake London has dealt with for his entire career. He did not look like the same guy. So I'm dropping London, really not dropping in terms of dropping him off your roster, dropping him into that wide receiver 3 range. If I have 3 guys that I like better, I'm okay with sitting London until I see him and Cousins look like what we expected.
All right. Week 1 is in the books. Week 2 is coming up. Great to get your advice, Heath. And we'll see what happens for everybody's fantasy football seasons. And hopefully everybody can get to the waiver wire and add if they need to. Heath, appreciate the time as always. Thanks for the great work.
Thanks.